At its peak, one company in Chicago was making more guitars than every other guitar maker on the planet combined. 10 years later, the factory was silent. The floors were empty, and the name was being sold off to the lowest bidder. This is the story of Harmony, the brand that put a guitar in the hands of more Americans than any other company in history, and how it all fell apart. In January 1892, a German immigrant named Wilhelm Schultz walked away from a steady job and started a company in 2 rented rooms on the top floor of a building in downtown Chicago. He had no wealthy backers, no famous name, no guarantee that anyone would buy what he was making. He had 4 employees, a handful of tools, and a belief that working Americans deserved access to affordable, well-built musical instruments. That belief turned out to be worth more than anyone could have predicted. Chicago in the 1890s was one of the most important cities in the world for manufacturing. It sat at the crossroads of America's railroad network. It had direct access to the Great Lakes shipping lanes. Raw materials flowed in from every direction, and finished goods flowed back out to every corner of the country. If you wanted to build something and sell it to America, there was no better city on earth to do it from. Schultz understood this. He started with violins and small stringed instruments, serving the working class neighborhoods of Chicago with instruments that ordinary families could actually afford. By 1894, just 2 years after opening, Harmony already had 40 employees. By the time the company moved into a larger facility at the corner of Green Street and Chicago Avenue, it was already outgrowing every space it moved into. That pattern, build it, fill it, move to something bigger, would continue for the next 70 years. What made Harmony different from the start was not just price. It was the understanding that music was not a luxury. In the immigrant neighborhoods of Chicago in the 1890s, a violin or a mandolin was a connection to home. It was the thing families carried with them across the ocean that no customs officer could confiscate. Schultz had come from that world himself. He knew what it meant to want an instrument and not be able to afford the ones that existed. He built Harmony to solve that problem, and he built it in a city that was perfectly positioned to deliver the solution to the entire country. Sears comes knocking. By 1915, Harmony had become the largest ukulele manufacturer in the United States. The ukulele craze was sweeping college campuses. Hawaiian music was everywhere. Every young person in America wanted one, and Harmony was the company that could make them fast enough and cheap enough to meet that demand. That caught the attention of someone very powerful. Sears, Roebuck and Company, the retail giant based right there in Chicago, had a simple but ruthless business strategy. Find whatever the American public wants, then control the manufacturing and distribution of it entirely. In 1916, Sears bought Harmony. On the surface, it looked like a takeover. In practice, it turned into rocket fuel. Sears had the most powerful retail distribution network in the country. Their catalog reached into rural homes that had no access to music stores, families in small towns across the Midwest, the South, and the Plains, states where the nearest instrument shop might be 100 miles away. For those families, the Sears catalog was the store. And now, the Sears catalog had Harmony guitars. The numbers that followed were staggering. By 1923, Harmony was selling 250,000 instruments per year. Guitars, banjos, mandolins, and ukuleles flowing out of Chicago and into the homes of ordinary Americans at a rate nobody had seen before. By 1930, that number had reached 500,000 instruments in a single year. 500,000. In a year that included the Great Depression. That last point matters. The Depression destroyed companies all across America. Banks collapsed. Factories closed. Unemployment hit 25%. And Harmony kept selling. Because when money is tight, people still want music. And Harmony made instruments that even struggling families could afford. Their price point was not just a business decision. It was the reason they survived, when so many others did not. There is something else worth saying about the Sears relationship that often gets overlooked. Sears did not just distribute Harmony guitars. They also sold instruments under their own house brand, Silvertone. Many of those Silvertone instruments were built in the same Chicago factory, by the same workers, on the same production lines. The Silvertone name became iconic in its own right. A whole generation of American guitarists grew up on Silvertone guitars without ever knowing they were holding a Harmony. One factory, multiple names, an invisible empire of affordable instruments spreading across the country through catalog pages and mailboxes. The factory that could not stop growing. By the time the post-war boom arrived, Harmony was a manufacturing operation unlike anything the music industry had ever seen. In 1962, the company moved into a brand new, purpose-built factory at 4600 South Colon Avenue in the Archer Heights neighborhood of Chicago. A second building was added on the same block shortly after. Together, the two facilities gave Harmony 125,000 square feet of production space, an enormous footprint dedicated entirely to building guitars, basses, and other stringed instruments. Inside those walls, a system had been built over decades to produce instruments with extraordinary efficiency. Workers had specialized roles. German and Eastern European craftsmen handled the woodcutting, shaping, and forming, many of them brought over specifically by Schultz in the company's early years or following in the tradition of those original workers. The finish rooms were staffed by Latino workers who became experts in the painting and lacquering process. Every person in that building had a function, a rhythm, a place in the production chain. The guitars that came out of this system were not the most expensive instruments in the world. They were never trying to be. A Harmony guitar in 1960 was what a first guitar looked like for millions of American kids. It was the instrument under the Christmas tree. It was the thing a teenager saved up for with summer job money. It was accessible, playable, and good enough to learn on, which is all it ever needed to be. The artists who learned on Harmony guitars read like a history of American music. Howlin Wolf, Elvis Presley in his early years, Keith Richards, Syd Barrett, Big Joe Williams. These were not hobbyists who dabbled. These were people who went on to define entire genres, and many of them started with a Harmony, the peak and the first signs of trouble. In 1964 and 1965, Harmony reached the top of the mountain. The Beatles had just arrived in America. Rock and roll had turned from a teenage fad into a cultural revolution. Every kid in the country wanted a guitar, and the demand was unlike anything the industry had ever experienced. Harmony's Chicago factory was running at full capacity, turning out instruments as fast as the production lines could move. In those 2 years, Harmony sold 350,000 instruments. They were making more guitars than every other guitar manufacturer on the planet combined. The factory on South Colon Avenue was the single most productive guitar building facility in human history. But right there at the top, right in that moment of maximum success, the seeds of collapse were already being planted. Japanese manufacturers had been watching the American guitar market closely. Companies like Teisco, Guillotine, and others had studied what American buyers wanted. They had access to lower labor costs that American factories simply could not match. And critically, they had understood something about the market that Harmony had not fully processed. The entry-level buyer did not have deep brand loyalty. They bought cheap. If something cheaper came along, they would buy that instead. Through the late 1960s, Japanese imports began arriving on American shores in growing numbers. They were priced below Harmony. In many cases, they were built to a comparable standard, and they came with a crucial advantage. They did not have to pay American wages, American overheads, or the costs of maintaining a 125,000 square foot factory in Chicago. Harmony's response was too slow and too cautious. The company had been successful for so long by doing things a specific way that changing course felt almost impossible. Decades of momentum had built an operation that was optimized for a market that was starting to shift beneath its feet. What made the Japanese competition particularly brutal was the timing. Harmony was not facing this threat from a position of weakness. They were facing it from the peak. The instinct at the top of any business is to protect what you have built, to keep doing what made you successful. That instinct, completely understandable and almost universal, was exactly the wrong response. The market was not rewarding what Harmony had built anymore. It was rewarding whoever could hit the lowest price on the shelf. And Harmony, with its Chicago factory and its American workforce and its decades of overhead, could not win that fight. The slow retreat. As the 1960s turned into the 1970s, Harmony began its retreat in stages, each one a little more desperate than the last. First, they pulled back from the mid-range. The decent quality instruments that sat above the absolute cheapest models started disappearing from the lineup. The company narrowed its focus to the very bottom of the market. Basic student guitars sold through JCPenney and department store catalogs, fighting for a shrinking slice of a market where the competition was now almost entirely foreign. Then they started doing something that should have been unthinkable for a company that had built its reputation on American manufacturing. They began importing instruments from Asia and relabeling them with the Harmony name. Think about what that means for a moment. The company that had once employed hundreds of skilled craftsmen in a dedicated Chicago factory, the company whose production methods had been refined over 70 years, was now putting its name on guitars built overseas and shipping them through American distribution channels. The Harmony name was being used to sell the exact same category of product that was destroying Harmony's ability to compete. The workers who remained in the Chicago factory watched the order volumes shrink. The production lines that had once run at full speed began slowing down. Skilled craftsmen who had worked at Harmony for decades started to understand that their skills were no longer the asset they had always been. There is a particular cruelty to that kind of decline. It is not sudden. It does not arrive as one devastating announcement. It comes as a slow draining away. Fewer orders this month than last month. A production line that runs half a day instead of a full one. A colleague who does not come back after a layoff and whose machine just sits there. The people inside the Harmony factory in the early 1970s did not need anyone to explain what was happening. They could feel it in the pace of the work. They could see it in the empty sections of the floor that had once been full. By 1975, it was over. The Chicago factory closed. The floors that had once been loud with machinery, sawdust, and the movement of hundreds of workers went silent. The building that had made more guitars than any other place on Earth was empty. What the factory floor actually represented. It is easy to look at the Harmony story as a straightforward tale of a company that got outcompeted, and on a surface level, that is what it was. But look closer at what was actually lost when those doors closed. Harmony was not just a guitar company. It was the single most important pipeline between ordinary Americans and music. For most of the 20th century, if you grew up in a rural town, a working-class neighborhood, or a family without much money, a Harmony guitar was how you got your hands on a real instrument, not a toy. A real playable guitar that could take you somewhere if you had the dedication to learn. The catalog guitar that arrived in a cardboard box on your front porch was, for many people, the first serious thing they ever owned. It represented a parent's investment in a kid's future. It represented a teenager's decision to become a musician. It represented the idea that music was not just for people who could afford expensive things. When the factory closed, that pipeline did not disappear overnight, but it shifted. The cheap guitars that replaced Harmony on the department store shelves were not made by people who had spent decades refining the craft. They were mass-produced to hit a price point. Full stop. The workers who had built instruments with genuine skill, who took pride in what came off their production line, were replaced by industrial processes in countries where no one had ever heard of the Archer Heights factory. What came after? The Harmony name did not disappear quietly. It got picked up, passed around, and put on products that had nothing to do with the original company's standards or history. In 1976, the brand was purchased and restarted with a lineup of Asian-made instruments. Essentially the same category of product that had killed the original company, now wearing its name. The guitars were copies of other designs, assembled in Korea, bearing the established 1892 tagline on the headstock, as if heritage were something you could attach to an imported product with a sticker. The name changed hands again over the following decades, cycling through various owners who understood its catalog value better than its actual meaning. It was not until 2018 that someone made a genuine attempt to restore what the name had once stood for. BandLab Technologies relaunched Harmony as a real instrument brand, with guitars built in the United States, ironically at the Heritage Guitars plant in Kalamazoo, Michigan, the same building where Gibson had operated until 1984. Former Gibson employees now building Harmony instruments in a former Gibson factory. History has a strange sense of humor. Whether the revival can build something that matches the original's cultural impact is a different question entirely. A name can be bought, a catalog can be revived, but the thing that made Harmony matter, the idea that a working-class family in rural Mississippi or a coal miner's kid in West Virginia could flip open a catalog and order a real guitar for a few dollars, that was built over 80 years of scale, infrastructure, and commitment to a price point that modern American manufacturing simply cannot reach. The revival is real, and the instruments are genuinely good. But the original Harmony was not just a guitar company. It was a public utility for music. You cannot rebuild that with a relaunch campaign. Harmony made 10 million guitars between 1945 and 1975. 10 million instruments that went into American homes, American bedrooms, American garages where bands were forming and songs were being written for the first time. The company did not fail because it made bad products. It did not fail because Americans stopped wanting to play guitar. It failed because it could not adapt fast enough to a market where the rules had changed, where the cost of labor in another country could undercut decades of domestic manufacturing expertise overnight. But here is the part of the story that never makes it into the business case studies. Every one of those 10 million guitars was touched by a human being in Chicago who knew what they were doing, who shaped the wood, applied the finish, set the neck, and sent it out the door with a level of care that a pure price competition exercise could never fully replicate. The factory floors on South Colon Avenue are long gone now. The buildings have been repurposed. The machinery was sold off or scrapped. The workers scattered. But somewhere right now, there is a guitar player. Someone famous. Someone unknown. Someone just learning. Whose entire relationship with music traces back to a cardboard box that arrived at their door with a Harmony inside. That is what those empty floors used to make. Subscribe if that kind of story matters to you, because there are more of them. Factories, brands, and the people behind them that the history books forgot to mention.